So one thing that I wish had maybe been emphasized a little bit more when I took a PDC, the sort of later chapters of the designer's manual, so the focus on invisible structures. And one thing that I found was that I could compost all of my waste for the rest of my life, and it wouldn't necessarily have an impact beyond the parcel that I'm a part of. But that by engaging with these broader power structures and policy systems, that there's really an opportunity to make larger change, and that the social element of permaculture design can be extended well beyond just how we work with ourselves and our neighbors and our communities, but even beginning to engage with these broader policy structures. And I find that that's not necessarily the place where change happens, but it's certainly a place. And so I would say that it's important to keep in mind that while we may emphasize or focus a lot on the individual site design, that the connections that a site has with its surrounding, with the neighbors and a neighborhood is really important, but also the ways that we are working with the existing, say, power systems to modify them to support the types of futures that we envision.
The other thing that we're doing, which is really a blessing, is we're looking at what's been here before, what's been planted here before, and I've been really paying attention to what doesn't need a lot of water. So we have oregano here, we have sage here, we have even some of these raspberries aren't really needing that much water in this particular climate. Lemon balm is here, and a lot of pollinators like scabiosa and edible chrysanthemums, and garlic, society garlic, which is a perennial garlic, which is delicious but also attracts bees. We're trying to work with what wants to happen on this land. So we regard our involvement and interaction with the land as a conversation rather than, okay, we're going to impose with, we're actually composing with. Or I should say, instead of imposing on, we're composing with. So a lot of things are going to seed, and we let them go to seed. Our plants here are being allowed to grow rather than being made to grow. That's our philosophy. So if something isn't happy here, they just die, and that's sad. But we're not going to force an issue. We really I've been observing to see what plants want to be here. And then this bed, here's my new idea. I finally figured this out. We've been having problems with this bed. This is a cob bed that we took the soil from the pond and built this bed, right? But we actually had cattails and all kinds of things growing up, and comfrey growing up through a bunch of rock and gravel, up through about 12 inches of cob into this bed. So I haven't really repaired it until we're really ready, but I finally got the right, I know what I'm going to do now. I'm going to plant chamomile, Roman chamomile on this bed. And it's kind of like, if you can't beat it, join it. And then if other plants, like right here's some sheep sorrel coming up in there, these other plants, and it'll just turn into a whole bed of fragrant chamomile on here. And that was my big aha, thinking about what are we going to do about this bed? And the problem is the solution. So the problem is plants are growing in the bed. Well, then let's just work with nature, be nature working, and go with the flow. So that's sort of an example of how permaculture would work. You don't keep fighting it, or let's spray herbicides on there to kill the plants so we can plaster the bed and have it be this perfect tickety-boo bed. Let's just let it evolve into what it wants to be. And so I'm going to try that and see what happens.
So right now we're on the site of where we're going to build our main facility, and we chose this site in relation to a lot of permaculture principles because there's a natural spring right up the way right there that we can tap into. We also have tons of water that flows through this natural marsh area every winter and goes right into Coleman Creek over there. And then also we have access to greenhouses and other mushroom growing hoop houses that we can have in the sun, and we can do some warmer varieties. But we really try to think about these principles and how we can work with the land to build our facility, and we can't wait to share it with you guys when it's finished.
So us brothers here, we just wanted to thank you very much for interest in our business, and we can't wait to show you what what we're actually going to be doing here. We're just starting out slow, but once we get it going, we're going to get big.
Yeah, please check us out on social media. We have a lot of educational videos on our YouTube station and on our mycolabsolutions.com website. Our jerky website will be shroomjerky.com. You can find that product there. And then for all your other mycology needs, we sell spawn, we sell all sorts of whatever you need for the lab, and help you get started growing mushrooms.
Yep. Thanks again.
Aloha.
Yeah, so here we're in what we call our south garden, because it's generally a south and east facing slope, and it's the warmer of our two main production gardens relative to slope aspect. And it's a terraced garden, and you can see these terraces are on the contour, and the beds are laid on the contour and they're terraced down. And then we're again underneath much of the cover here is very deep, rich, organic soil, and there's plants such as potatoes that are working right now, or even the perennial tree collards, which is a lovely perennial edible co-mixed in there. Got a lot of cover crops happening right now, nitrogen fixing legumes, fava beans, vetch, bell beans, various types of clovers, where many of the beds we're allowing them to be engaged with the soil food web and carbon fixation and nitrogen fixation and that kind of processes for giving them a bit of a rest. And so then adjacent to the area we just were at, a meeting room above the south garden, we move into an area we call the Mediterranean slope. And so here there's figs in the back and citrus next to the nopales, which are the edible pads and useful for natural building, with the tunas, the fruit. And then behind that we have olives and carob and big rosemary bushes and jujubes, and then it moves through the kiwis, into the loquats, into the pineapple guavas, the various layers and multi-stacked systems. Cardoons, an artichoke relative, again hummingbird plants. Lavenders next to citrus, next to native eriogonums. So now we've come around the peninsula and started on the south side, went around the east face, and now we're on the north facing slope. This is called the North Garden because of its slope aspect. It's the larger of the two main gardens. This one's about an acre in size. Again, there's the annual production beds that radiate off with a central main pathway with perennial borders on either side, and surrounded by edible food forests or perennials like long-lived roses, bamboos, and mulberries, and apples and peaches and plums, and this is very much our European temperate space. So whereas on the south side we were looking at the feijoas, the pineapple guavas, we were looking at the loquats, the things that look a little bit almost subtropical, the carobs. Over here, this is very much more feeling like a northern temperate space, with the roses and the apples and the plums and the pears. And each of the gardens, the north and south garden, back in the 70s when the Farallones put them in, built a small pond next to it to function as a stormwater pond and for recharge and sediment, but also they function as a habitat pond. No, this pond is just simply excavated out of the native soil. So we have a clay-based soil here, and so it seals itself to some degree, but it is leaky, which is good because leakiness means recharge to groundwater. And then it also then becomes a dominant habitat again for newts and our Pacific chorus frogs. Again, those frogs are eating their weight in insects on a daily basis as the little babies emerge in the spring and make their way out into the garden to provide that pest control for us. So having a system adjacent to each garden as part of the integration of the water element with soil elements, with plant elements in our garden system by design. This is all by design and relative location. The OAC's on an 80-acre parcel. There's about 10 acres in a deer fence, and then there's the remaining 70 acres. Here's a spot we've been working on. We're doing riparian stream restoration, erosion control, swales up on the sides, so we intentionally pick the creek out of its banks to flood the terraces to sequester sediment and recharge groundwater. We've made artificial beaver dams upstream, again, to increase the width of the stream to sequester sediment, because we know fine sediment downstream is one of the most damaging pollutants to clogging up the spawning gravels of the coho salmon and the steelhead. So this is a coho salmon steelhead restoration project in an upland system where we're using native plants and stream hydrology, natural processes, and recharging groundwater, which then allows us to have water in the summer for other wildlife to drink from. And we've been doing limbing and thinning for fuel load for fire control. And the products of the limbing and thinning, the dead tree trunks, we're then folding in and making intentional beaver dam analogs to hold the sequestered sediment back. So the problem of fire becomes a solution to water and soil and water quality and salmon recovery in a relative location, as we have an integrated wildland system of watershed-based conservation hydrology. We get a lot of sheet flow off of this system. So in a couple areas where in the rains we've excavated these contours here, and as you can see there's a whole sequence of them. They step down this slope and they're basically terraces, but you can see in the base of them now they actually have some water in them because we just got a rain event the other day. So these will fill up during the rain event, and then they'll slowly allow that water to recharge into the groundwater. So we're attempting to reduce the total amount of runoff volume and timing that gets to the creek so it's not as flashy, and we're trying to hold it on the land and allow it to get into the soil so it can leak through the soil. And we want that water to get to the stream. We just want it to get there months later to support stream flows instead of all coming during the storm event. So these on-contour infiltration trenches are one way in which we have a means of intercepting and slowing, spreading, sinking, storing, and sharing that water that otherwise was considered to be a problem during the winter when it's too flashy. I mean, I think another thing as a permaculture designer is we have our three ethics of earth care, people care, and fair share. And if we're really going to step up to the earth care piece, then we have to figure out how to work with people and our land use settlement patterns. And one of the patterns that is as destructive as anything in a watershed is the road network. As my good friend Danny Hagans would say, nothing in nature mimics a road. And so how roads either derange hydrology, intercept the flow, concentrate the flow, accumulate sediments, and erode out and downcut streams is an epidemic on the planet. So we work with a number of folks like the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, our local Gold Ridge Resource Conservation District, on a project that's called Fish Friendly Roads. And basically we're trying to change the shape of our road such that we discharge the drainage of the road intercepting the sheet flow as frequently as possible in areas where we can then have a smaller discharge, and any sediment from the road can then be sequestered and kept on site, and clean water can leave instead of delivering dirty sediment-laden water to the stream, again, that impacts the salmon downstream. So one of those is to have a road that's outsloped, and then we put called rolling dips. And so in front of us you can see this little rise that was created by an excavator and a bulldozer, and then it goes into a dip up to the next rise, and we've segmented the road into a little sort of whoop-de-doo like a roller coaster, so that water from here only goes to here and discharges. And this is a dam, if you will. It's basically a series of little swale diversion type dams on the road. And so as you come up the face on the back side of it, at the crest of what's called the rolling dip, then it goes down, and then you can see how we've intercepted the water. The water's flowing across here, it's crossing the road, and then we created a space here where all that sediment can settle out. And in this case we've actually sown in here native perennial bunch grasses like our blue Elymus glaucus, our blue wild rye, and made a moistened space that they like. And so we've created conditions for the problem of sediment to be discharged on site and make a subhabitat that then allows us to increase our restoration efforts for a perennial coastal prairie bunchgrass community. In our world and in everywhere, no water, no life, no water, no food. And whether that's from the sky above or you store it and irrigate it like we have to in the Mediterranean in the dry season, we don't live in a water scarce area, we live in a storage scarce area, and storage is really everything. And so what you're looking at here is our pond, or the dam, and the dam here is 100% filled by runoff in the uplands when it rains here. We're way up high in the watershed. We're not down low. We're not blocking fish passage or impacting the salmon that way. The way we are impacting the salmon is that we capture this excess winter runoff from the adjacent land use and then store it, and then we can use that for irrigation in the dry season, which then means we're not using groundwater that could be taking out critical water in the dry season that should be better made available to the stream during the dry season for the small fish. So this is a 100% rainwater harvesting based irrigation pond. It also is a place to go swimming. It's also a place for aquaculture. It's also a place for wildlife habitat. And when there's been emergency fires, they've showed up with a helicopter and taken buckets of water out here. So in the world of stacking functions, water is one of the most fundamental things that you can have in your design. And I always, as a designer, when I show up on a site and I'm doing my protracted and thoughtful observation, my PATO, I look at the site first and I say, what would water want? Because if I can figure out how to support what water would want, then I'm getting at what life would want, and what life would want is probably close to what we would want as humans for whatever integrated design we would like, if that only in your mind is that you're growing a food forest. So the water here, and by design, when it was built in the late 70s, it's high in the landscape, so it's able to catch water high, and then it's through plumbing is able to then provide that water through gravity pressure, solely through gravity, all the way down and irrigate the gardens. So we're about 100 feet in elevation higher than the north garden we were at before, and that's enough to run all the sprinklers without any assistance otherwise than just the weight of water through gravity. So it's a very elegant and simple system, and it's an amazing place. Water, as Luna Leopold would say, the health of our waters is the principal measure of how we live on the land. And if the water quality and quantity is better for your settlement there, you're doing a good job. If it's not, if there's less of it or it's more polluted, you got work to do. Water's the most truthful thing you'll ever meet. And it's very, so as a designer, we need feedback. If you don't have feedback, you can't make adjustments. You can't tailor, customize your design. And the air quality and water quality, soil health and biodiversity, cultural integrity are primary mechanisms of feedback upon which any ecological designer, permaculture designer, is attuning themselves to that feedback and adjusting their design accordingly towards those meta goals of Earth Care, People Care, Fair Share. Here's kind of another view of a rolling dip. When we outslope that road, we have a rolling dip. We're directing the flow of water into this ditch, which we put organic matter and branches in. And this is a carbon filter. It's like a gauze bandage of material that was limbed and thinned that slows the flow, sequesters the sediment, and discharges clean, clear water to the creek for the coho. And so it's all about redesigning the road shape.
We have Temescal Creek running underneath here, major watershed. It's in a 12-foot culvert. Unfortunately, the ideal thing was we would daylight that, bring that creek back out, but that would basically take up this whole site with the ways we'd have to do setback, and it would flood this whole area. That's why the development that's happened here has basically limited the reach in which that water can go. But as any ecological designer, permaculturalist, or land person knows, you connect with your water and you connect with your watershed. So how do we figure out a way to emulate that? And on this site, it's really interesting. We have a mile corridor, a green corridor that has already been developed by the community, and we're going to extend that through this site when they develop it and turn it into a natural stream bed that will take the water that we would be using for the roof and run it through a natural system. And within that system, we'll incorporate the native fish, and it'll turn into kind of like a aquaponic system in the sense that we're creating a fish nutrient-rich water source that will also be enlivened and enriched and aerated. And for me, it's hard to do the aquaponics when the fish are in a basement or not connected with light and their natural environment. So this I can justify in that sense, and it'll also emulate where the creek would flow, and it'll give people that sense of connection. And I think that's our most important thing, is connecting people with food.
It's a beautiful afternoon. I'm doing my sit spot, observing the landscape. And this class is about site analysis and mapping and functional analysis. And it's a really important one because the first principle, observe and interact, there's a reason why it's the first. And a lot of times we get quite excited when we start learning all these different ways to do permaculture. And we want to design right away. We say, yes, let's get in there and let's start planting things out and building and constructing and working with the landscape. And the analysis to the space is extremely important. You want to know, what am I working with? Am I working with a very broad landscape that has deep slopes and terrain and maybe different streams and riverbeds that are coming into a certain part of the landscape that needs to be addressed or left alone? Or maybe we're working with a small space, like here we have a couple acres that they started working on the landscape and they ran out of resources in people, money, time, because there wasn't an analysis for those things, right? We didn't look at and say, okay, what are the accesses to the space? And how do we access it in such a way that it is low maintenance? So access roads, are they designed in such a way that they have low maintenance, right? Or are we designing them to get from one point to the other as quickly as possible? And this is why we kind of stress to design roads on contours. So maybe you don't access the areas of the land as quickly as possible. However, you reduce drastically the amount of maintenance required on the roads, as well as how they can actually be a problem in the future rather than a benefit to the landscape. So that multifunctional aspect of how we design is a critical key point in designing the landscapes. Also in our site analysis, this is where we begin to apply what we learned in our climate and microclimate effects. So we look at each element and say, okay, what kind of climate am I in? Am I in a tropical climate, or cool temperate, warm temperate? Am I in a maritime environment? Is it desert-like? Is it Mediterranean? I mean, there's so many different environments. Definitely learn that first. What kind of climate am I in? The second aspect is, how am I working with precipitation? Do I get tons of rainfall? Very little? What are the durations of that rainfall and the intensities of it, so that I can design not only for how to work with it, but in scenarios where a disaster can occur. And we have a class on disaster, designing for disasters. But for now, we want to understand, what am I working with? And we're writing this down in our site analysis sheet. Now you have a site analysis sheet that is provided to you, and you can look through this and just go through all the climates and the microclimates. This is what we're analyzing in the site. The microclimates as far as the structures, as well as the vegetation that's on the site, and as well as the animals as well. We want to include that into our analysis. The wildlife that is there, the domesticated animals if they're already there, as far as horses are concerned, or dogs, even that's an animal, and cats that we might want to understand, how do we integrate that in our design? Whether it is a big landscape or it's your backyard, we're still analyzing the site and seeing how we work with topography, for example. I've seen great changes in 2-3 inches of topography and what plants can grow, or how the soil is affected, whether it's too compacted or it's too loose, or all these various facets of the quality of the soil. We want to know, what can we do to improve our ability to design the space well. This is very important to our design. So the 5 microclimates and the 3 climates, right? So the wind, where is it coming from? How is it prevailing? What are the intensities? Do we get tornadoes? Right? Where, working with that wind, and then how to use it to our advantage, or learn of the disadvantages and how to design for that, so we are prepared, right? As well as the the sun's intensity, how much light in the wintertime, how much light in the summertime, so we can understand what plants to grow, for example, and how to mitigate that sun or utilize that sun's energy for solar energy, say for example, or for passive solar energy, or for a whole variety of things. The main point is that you understand what you're working with and how that will affect your design. And that's how we are actually harmonizing with the natural systems that surround us. Because we say, okay, I understand it as best we can. Of course, we don't know or can't know everything, but as best we can, we understand it and we begin to apply in this way. And this is not only key just for designing your place, but if you're designing for somebody else, they're counting on you to actually take the time to look at these things so that when you apply them, it represents a permaculture whole system design approach. And so look at this sheet and really adequately, as best as you can, fill it out and use that as a template for the next steps, which are the exciting steps, of course, where you can start, I want to put in greenhouses, and I want to put in windmills, and I want to put in this, that, and the other. It's great. And the excitement actually even comes when you really know how to do it well and how to do it in such a way that it's actually making a difference in your environment and in the design that you're creating for yourself or for others. Okay? The functional analysis is also a very key aspect to this, where you're looking at a function of each element. And so we want to understand, for example, you'll see this in your book and it's really great, the functions of bees, the functions of chickens, the functions of your structures. You want to see that once you analyze what you're working with and that you understand the function of those, then you can see the connections and how they can be integrated, right? And so I'm going to give you a few examples of that, where you can look at the examples of certain images and then learn how to take advantage of the expression of the various functions that are coming out from each element. Your animals, your structures, your water systems, your vegetation, and as well as the functions of the wind and the rain and the sun and all these various aspects to design. So take, for example, this site here. Now, I'm in Belize, and this is my first time actually experiencing what can grow here and what the animals are like and the plants are like. And to be honest with you, I don't know most of this stuff. I know a few things, right? But I don't know all the various species that are here and what plants are here. And so, of course, I would do the site analysis, where I'll take my time and look and see and understand how the space works. They started working on it. They had some permaculture thoughts in mind, and they've looked at some books and they said, okay, let's make this happen. And one person said, it'd be great if we had some animals. And so I'm going to plant a grass. And that grass is really good for the various cows that we want to bring here. They didn't bring the cows yet, as you can see, and they planted it in a very small patch. And they were able to manage and maintain that small patch while they were establishing the grass to be able to plant out in the future when they get the animals. The animals never happened. People got kind of distraught by the amount of energy that goes into developing and working on land, because they never had before. And they let the grass grow. Unfortunately, it wasn't understood how invasive the grass can be. So if you look and see here, the entire space has been completely taken up by grasses. They had an idea of maybe doing a food forest as well. Those trees, they can't even be seen. They're completely covered and are suffering. I don't know if they're even alive anymore. And so there was energy that went into it, and then the output of energy has now become vast beyond their measure of being able to take care of it. And so it is essential to use the functional analysis and the site analysis as a tool to not make so many mistakes, right? And also not get overwhelmed when you're doing your design, right? And don't be afraid, it's not so hard, it's fairly easy, but it's really, and you're gonna make mistakes, and it's okay. I've made many, trust me, many mistakes. So it's okay if you make some mistakes. However, it is awesome when you get certain things right and they work very well for you rather than against you. And so yeah, take this as a great example as far as considering site analysis as a part of your design. Okay? Thank you for joining me in this class. We're going to move on to some much more beautiful classes as far as moving from the pattern. So this is still a kind of pattern language, understanding the patterns of nature and how they work, into now learning about how to design. So as you continue to dive into the pattern understanding of the climates, the microclimates, how they function, how all the elements in your system function, and eventually, as we go into design, how they integrate. And this is kind of like the magic and what really excites me about permaculture. You're going to see that there's a brilliance to it. There's a brilliance and an intelligence to how this is starting to formulate and create systems that work with you rather than against you. Okay? So, take for example, on this land here, what we see is this huge terrain of grass. This grass was planted in a very small space for eventually working with animals, right? Working with cattle as a fodder for them, as a food for them, food source. Cattle never came, and the grass started to be unmanaged, and look, it took over the entire plain. And so it's really important to understand if the species you're implementing are invasive, or if you have invasive species on your land, which ones are they, so that you can manage or eliminate them while you're establishing what you want to establish. Here they wanted to do a food forest, zone 2, as well as a zone 3 animal system, and now it's been kind of abandoned and taken over by the invasive grass. Now, I'm sure there's opportunities that lie in here, and so it's not necessarily a permanent problem. You can turn that around, but it's good to not create the problems in the first place.